Welcome back, my favorite game developers. In this video we've actually started spawning enemies in a smart way. So now when we run the game, let's make this a bit bigger so you can see properly what's happening. After the countdown finishes, the first enemy appears, the second enemy appears, and they just sit there waiting for us to kill them. So once we do kill them, let's try to kill them. Okay, that's actually... Okay, that was embarrassing. Let's restart the level. Wait for that. So we made enemies so good that we cannot kill them. Okay, so let me try. Let me get to a certain distance so he can no longer... So once we kill them, you can see that we have the wave complete, and then again we get the enemy spawning because we've made the amount of enemies in here too for this wave. So let's not waste any more time and let's get started. Okay, so let's go ahead and actually start spawning enemies. The first thing that we're going to do is obviously create in here some kind of either a coroutine, or we can create also a counter. But we're going to stick with the coroutine, and this coroutine will be called every time we have this spawn delay. So this coroutine will be spawning the enemies. Anyways, let's get started and we'll see how everything is working. So we're going to create an I enumerator in here, and it's going to be called the spawn wave and the wave that we want to actually spawn. So wave to spawn. So we already have the wave that we want to spawn. It will have its own enemies, its name, and the amount of enemies it has. So we're going to create a for loop. And in this for loop, we're going to start with an integer of I equals 0. We are going to make sure that we never go over the wave to spawn. Where is it? The wave to spawn dot the amount of enemies. And we are also going to be increasing it by 1 every single time. So in here, we are going to create a random enemy number, and it's going to be the random dot range, and this range will be over 0, and the wave to spawn dot enemies dot length. So there we go. And remember that enemies in here is an array of game objects, so we want to spawn a random enemy in there. So I'm going in here where we'll say that some kind of method to spawn, because we want to have it outside this right here. This will only be the spawn wave. This will be the enemy spawner in here. And what we'll do, and the way this I enumerator will work, is we are going to yield return new wait for seconds, and it's going to be on the wave to spawn dot delay, dot spawn delay. So what's happening in here, this is the first time I believe that we use the yield return inside of a for loop in an I enumerator or a coroutine. So we go through this loop. Every single time we choose a random number, we spawn some kind of enemy, and then we wait for seconds, and then again we spawn an enemy, we spawn an enemy. So this will allow us to yield return and call this multiple times, this spawn wave several times. And after we do this, we are going to create also the actual method that will spawn the enemy. So spawn enemy, and in here we are going to say that we will send it the game object and the enemy to spawn. And in here we're going to say debug.log, just to make sure that we know which enemy is being spawned and everything is working correctly. So spawning the enemy, and we're going to give it the enemy to spawn dot name. There we go. And we are simply going to instantiate the enemy to spawn, and it's going to be, so it's going to be on the transform dot position and the transform dot rotation. So what is the transform? Which transform are we talking about? So because the wave spawner is attached to the level manager, this will be the position and the rotation of the level manager game object in our scene. And later on, we will be creating several points on which the enemies will be spawning. So it will work like that. We will have some kind of array. We'll deal with that later on. Let's now focus on actually instantiating these enemies. So spawn enemy, the wave to spawn dot enemies at the position of the random enemy number that we just created. So I'm going to add an enter in here. What are we doing? We need to also call the coroutine in here. So before we forget, so coroutine spawn enemy wave. Yep, there we go. And which wave should we be spawning? Well, in here we're just going to say that it's the waves at the position next wave. So it's going to be probably 0 right now, because next wave, where's next wave? It starts off at 0 right here. So it's going to be the first wave. That's for just experimenting for now. Let's focus on what this does. So a coroutine which starts, if we make sure that we are not spawning, if the countdown is less than 0, we are not spawning, we are ready to start spawning, then we start the coroutine. In here we have the loop. We loop through the amount of enemies on the wave that we receive as a coroutine. We create a random number, we spawn a random enemy, which just has the debug to tell us which enemy is being spawned. We'll probably remove this later on. And then we instantiate the actual enemy on the level manager. And then what happens? We yield return, wait for seconds, and then spawn another enemy. So before this loop then again is called, we have to wait the spawn delay that is designated to us. So I'm going to save all of that. I'm going to go back in Unity. And let's see what we have in here as a level manager. Wait for this to compile any day now. Okay, so we go to the managers, level manager, and what do we have in here? I was playing around, maybe I did not do this in the video. So we have this wave right here. It's the skeleton wave. The enemies that we have in here are the skeleton enemy and the cowardly flying eye. The amount of enemies we want is 2, and the spawn delay will be 2 seconds. I'm going to save this. Where's the level manager in our world? It's not on the 0, 0. Let's put it back to 0 so it's right in front of our player, and let's run the game and see what it looks like. So now 1, 2, we should see the wave countdown. There we go. And whoa, that's too much enemies. Let's see what we did wrong in here. So we save that. What's happening in here? We are checking the countdown is less than 0. Are we not in the spawning state? Well, let's see. We start off with the counting, so we're not. So obviously we need to change our states in here. So before we actually create the loop or start the loop, we are going to say that we are in a state which is equal to the spawning state dot spawning. And then when we finish spawning, we are going to go into a state which is the waiting. So we're waiting for the enemies to be spawned. So now we start, before we actually go through the loop, we set the state. So now this will not be called every single time and we will not have that many enemies. Let's again test this out. Run the game. We can see the countdown in here. I made it public. There we go. So at 0, we get the enemy and he starts shooting. And then we get another enemy. And then we get another enemy. And it's being called every 2 seconds. So look at these little cowards right here. This is a really nice, cool game mechanic. As you can see, every 2 seconds, 1, 2, 1, 2. And there we go. So as you can see, enemies are being called every single second. But you now might be wondering, why do we have so many enemies even though we said that the amount of enemies should be only 2? Well, it's because in here we don't actually have the wave countdown resetting again. This is something that we will deal with later on. But let's first of all think of when will we be actually resetting the wave and when does an actual wave end. So we can either create a time between waves. So let's say the first wave and the second wave, there is a delay between them. Or we can have some really nice mechanic and give our player, or the person that's playing our game, a chance to go ahead and kill all of the enemies in this wave before the next wave comes on. So this is what we are going to do, and to do that we are going to create some kind of method that will keep track of whether an enemy has died or not. So let's go back down here, and after the spawn enemy we are going to create a private. It's going to be a boolean, and it's going to be the enemies are alive, and this will return true if all of the enemies are alive, or no, oh yes, if all of the enemies are alive, and false if one of them or none of them are alive. So in here what I'm going to say, I'm going to create an if condition, and I'm going to have the find object of type, and objects of type, actually not find object, find objects of type. And the enemy controller, I'll be looking for the enemy controller dot length, and it's going to be equal to 0. And if it is, then we are going to return false. So why false? That means that all the enemies have died. And then if we go through this one and if we don't return false, then we are going to return true. That means that the enemies are still alive. So now we have a way of making sure whether our enemies have all been depleted, and we will be able to use it right here as a condition somehow. But there is a small problem that is bothering me. The find objects of type on the enemy controller is actually a very cumbersome, let's say, operation on the system. It takes up a lot of resources every time to go through all the objects on the enemy controller, which is sometimes not very necessary. So what we want to do is we want to have some kind of timer on the enemies are alive checker. So we don't actually check every single frame if all the enemies are dead, but instead we have this being checked every couple of seconds. So I'm going to issue it to you as a challenge, and your challenge is to delay checking. So first of all, you'll need to create a variable for the time between checking for enemies. In the boolean method, make sure that we don't look all the enemies up except when the time is done. Pay attention to where we should reset this counter, so this will be very important. So with that said, pause the video right now and go do the challenge. Okay, welcome back. So I'm going to scroll up in here, and I'm going to create a private float the time between enemy search, and let's say it's 1f, so 1 second. Every 1 second we check for all of the enemies if they are dead. And then in here I'm going to say that the time between search is being reduced by time dot delta time every single frame, and this will be called every single frame. And then down here I'm going to check, before we actually check for all the objects, if the time between search is less than or equal to 0, then we will be searching. There we go. And then when do we actually reset this? So once the time between search is less than or equal to 0, we start by checking if all of the enemies have died, and we also can go ahead and reset this time between searches. And I'm going to set it to 1f because I don't think that this is something that you might want to change in the inspector, the time between enemy searches. This can be pretty standard, but if you think that you might need to change this variable, obviously this 1f will not work. You'll need to go up here, create a separate variable. If you did that, congratulations, this is the better step, or the better way of thinking, the better game design maybe. But for me, I believe this will be something very constant, something that will not change. I don't think we will ever have to change the time between enemy searches. With that finished, let's go back up in here and we need to make sure that we, where is it? In here in update, we are going to check if the state is equal to the spawning states dot waiting. So that means we are constantly spawning enemies and we are in the waiting. So we check after we obviously finish this for loop, we check is the state the waiting. Then if it is, in here we are going to check if the enemies are alive, and notice that we added this exclamation mark, which means the exact opposite. So if all of the enemies have died, we're going to say debug.log wave complete, save that, and else if it's not, then we are going to simply return. And why are we doing this? Why are we saying return? We said that return means that we don't do anything else inside of the method, especially in update. Why? Because once the wave is complete, we don't want to go back into the wave countdown, check if we are not in spawning, which we will be not in because we are obviously in the waiting, and start the coroutine again and start creating the enemies again. So once the wave is complete, we want to stop the whole update from working. So I'm going to save that. I'm going to go back into my game, and now we should see that when we run the game, so we get, after 5 seconds of countdown, we get the cowardly enemy. After 2 seconds we get another cowardly enemy, and there we go. You can see that we have stopped everything, so we no longer get more enemies that we have to. So I'm going to try to kill those. So we killed both of them, and as you can see, again the wave has been completed, and then the enemies start spawning again. Okay, great. So with that out of the way, make sure to commit your changes. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next video where we'll be spawning points for multiple waves and completing all of them, killing all the enemies, completing all the waves, and maybe having some kind of really nice message. So I'll see you then.